Hey guys, and welcome to Generation Y. Just a quick prelude. Today I interviewed Will Knowland, the ex-Eton school teacher, English teacher, who was pushed out due to woke crap. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. I'm sorry it's a little bit glitchy. I'm not sure whether it was the software or his internet or my internet. I am hardwired. I'm hardwired as well as dongled. So I should be kind of okay. But I think the audio is basically perfect. So yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think, and I will see you again soon. Hey guys, and welcome to Generation Y. Today with me is Will Knowland. Hey Will, how are you?
Hello, Mark. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming. I feel privileged. So a lot of our viewers are American. Actually, many of them have heard of you still. But I just wondered. I know this must be driving you insane nowadays, but I just wondered if you could give a brief sort of, what happened to you.
Sure. Well, to cut a long story short, I offended a colleague by challenging the orthodox narrative about patriarchy and feminism that students get. And because that colleague was offended, I was sacked. So it's really about safe space in schools. Most people are familiar with this as it applies to students, for example, asking for particular lecturers to be deplatformed. But now it's about a teacher claiming to decide that based on the fact that they were offended,
Mm.
students aren't allowed to hear viewpoints for debate.
Okay. And the last thing I heard with that situation was that the TRA had cleared you of any
That's
wrongdoing in
right.
the school. Okay.
Yeah. So not only did the school sack me, but they also referred me to the Teaching Regulation Agency.
Mm-hmm.
And they claimed that they had to do that. But actually, schools only have to do that if, in their opinion, it meets the threshold for a referral. So they thought it really was serious enough that I could potentially be banned from the classroom for life. And
That,
we'll get into what was the content of the lecture shortly, because it really is laughable to think that they deemed it a possible lifetime ban. But luckily, the TRA saw sense and they didn't even bother investigating it further. They just knocked it straight out the moment they
wow.
saw it. There was no full investigation opened.
Oh wow. I didn't realize it was that quick.
Yeah, it didn't even reach the stage of a full hearing.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And how Simon Henderson, who I believe was the headmaster at the time,
Yeah.
how did he treat the situation, and how did he treat you personally?
I would say that it didn't have to end the way that it did. I mean, there's nothing in the nature of the Equality Act that means that that talk had to be dealt with like this, that lecture had to be dealt with like this. This has never happened anywhere in the world before. This kind of case has never been litigated. So it's a world first attempting to use the Equality Act or Eton's own internal equality policy.
Mhm.
People are familiar with these terms from equality, diversity, inclusion, equity. It's that whole movement that's sweeping through academic institutions and also workplaces across the Western world. It's
Mm.
the first attempt to use that to restrict curriculum content.
Wow. Wow. Jesus, I didn't know some of those things.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean that's why I made the stand that I did, because the point of principle at stake here is huge,
was
and it
huge.
really is the thin end of the wedge in schools. So whatever any
Oh,
teacher
yes.
finds personally upsetting, that's it. You can't discuss it in the classroom, even if only to disagree with it.
Yeah, it's terrifying, man. Like, yeah. Well, I'll go into other stuff later on, but yeah, I just remember wondering at the time, was this one of the first times that I don't believe it would be, but was this one of the first times that you'd come up against something like this? Or was this just a point where you were like, I'm going to push the boundaries a bit because I've been biting my lip for a while, and I feel like now's a good time to push something mildly provocative, and I stress the word mildly.
Yes, I mean, I've been in education for about 15 years by the time this had happened. So I know schools fairly well. I know what the intellectual climate is like. And most teachers who have written to me privately about this have expressed concern, saying that they now feel that there are some no-go areas in practice, even
Okay.
though in theory we should be able to have open, rigorous discussions about whatever controversial topics we want to bring up, because that's part of engaging and educating students. We don't want to wrap the world of ideas in cotton wool. Teachers aren't
Yeah.
supposed to be hiding kids from ideas. It's about introducing them to them and helping them to grapple with them. But
Yeah.
myself and so many other teachers have found that that's not really how it works. And political correctness, the woke stranglehold on some topics is becoming more and more intense. So I'd had various resources over the years blocked. People saying, "Oh no, we better not present that to students, or that might upset so and so." And they all seem to circle around topics regarding masculinity, feminism, patriarchy, and evolutionary psychology and biology as it pertains to those subjects.
Right.
And
Okay.
I thought, if I can't do this on Eton College's flagship debating course, which is tailor made for exactly this thing,
That's great.
then a big part of what I'm in education for has vanished. And there's a
Yeah.
sense in which my job's already gone
Yeah.
before I've actually lost it.
Yeah. Just you were talking about the flagship sort of debating service. Just explain what
Yeah.
that is to people that aren't familiar.
Yeah. So Eton is probably the UK's top school. Certainly one of the most famous, has produced something like 21 prime ministers off the top of my head. So this is about training young men to go into arenas where debate is going to be a big part of their lives, whether in business or politics.
Such a good
And
point.
when they get to sixth form age, which for US viewers is about age 17, so the last couple of years of what would be high school, we put them through a course called Perspectives, which is when they get all different kinds of viewpoints. And the aim is to stimulate debate. It's supposed to be controversial. And they're not even supposed to agree with the lectures. In fact, they're supposed to disagree and push back. So they're encouraged to pick apart the arguments of the lecturers. And the
So it's like a
theme
training.
for the
You're like
year,
training them.
yeah, exactly. And in the classroom, you'll even put them into different groups and say, okay, you defend the thesis of the lecturer, you argue against it, and
Yeah.
let's see where the logical fallacies are. Let's see
Yeah.
which premises are incorrect, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So there's no framing it in terms of brainwashing. You know, take notes. Mr. Noland is giving you God's truth here, and all you have to do is nod and say, "Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir." It's
As
the
it should
opposite
be.
of that, in fact. It's take it apart.
Yes.
Now, they weren't allowed to hear a 30-minute talk with 43 academic references in off the top of my head. And these are mainstream references too. This is people at Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, Yale, etc. And that really concerned me because the government specifically exempts curriculum content under the Equality Act. And the point of that is that students are free to discuss any ideas, no matter how controversial. But the legal loophole, apparently, is that that only applies to students, not teachers. And if teachers get
How
upset, well,
convenient.
then that's it. Debate's off.
That's ridiculous, man. I can't
It's
believe.
certainly.
Yeah, sorry. I just can't believe that they would do that with the teachers. I feel like that's their sort of that's their way of like having an emergency out. Like if anything gets too hot, then like the teacher could just hit the red buzzer and be like, "Well, I don't want to do this. I'm done."
I think you're right. But like I said, look, it's never been tried before. I don't think it will succeed in court because it is so contrary to the spirit of the government's advice. Why are the government saying we're exempting the ideas from the remit of the Equality Act, only to have someone come along and say, aha, yeah, for students, fine, but for teachers, no, no, no. That it's restricted very tightly based on what teachers find emotionally comfortable. So it really is about prioritizing the emotional well-being of staff over the intellectual challenge of students.
which is peculiar because we've spent so many decades, the last 4 or 5, doing everything we can to wrap children in cotton wool until they're sort of 22, and suddenly they realize that the world is not just cotton wool, and they become an emotional wreck. Um, it's also kind of worrying because my mum was involved with schools in Cambridge for a while, and a long while. And from what she's told me, even back then, 70, 80% of the teachers were what we would call woke. Uh, so if we've got all these teachers that are, you can't sort of begrudge somebody a political opinion by any means. But like, I think if they're at the furthest ends of either of those opinions, then and a vast amount of them are, then that can become a problem.
Yeah, and it's counterproductive shielding students from ideas because it works in exactly the same way that anxiety does generally. Let's say that you're scared of driving and you avoid driving. You just get more and more scared of it. And the range of activities related to driving that you can undertake shrinks. It's the same with the world of ideas. If you
Mm,
try and shield people from things they find upsetting, their tolerance, their growth emotionally and intellectually just gets stunted. And that's
mm,
what's being created. Students who are now, I suppose, seeing it in teachers as role models,
mm.
not wanting to confront things that challenge their own preconceptions.
Yeah, most worrying. You're not filling me with positivity here, Will.
Like I said, it's a big principle at stake, but
Yeah,
the positive sign to it is that more and more people are becoming aware of it. I think there's been a lot
yeah.
of sleepwalking into this state, and also people thinking it will blow over and naively hoping appeasement is the answer. But appeasement only emboldens these people.
Well, they don't appease anyone, do they? When did they ever appease any of their sort of enemies, in air quotes? They never do.
No, they
They,
keep the
they,
pressure up constantly and they do it very effectively.
yeah, yeah. You have to respect them for that, most definitely. So, can you tell us about the actual um, topic and the information that got you on the front page of some of Europe's biggest newspapers?
Yeah, you won't believe it. It's stuff that 5 minutes ago wasn't even controversial. Like I said, 30-minute talk, over 40 academic references, all mainstream. And essentially, it's looking at the interesting fact, which has been termed in research the patriarchy paradox, that the more gender equality is pushed in a society, and we see this in the Western world's most developed countries, the more, paradoxically, men and women actually diverge. So if you give people equality of opportunity, they tend to actually choose very different things.
Hmm.
So it suggests that actually the opposite of what the social constructionists predicted is true. So society can try and mold men and women to be more and more similar. But the opposite happens. There seems to be something essentially different about them, something rooted in human nature and biology. So it's not a social construct. So starting from that, which is a viewpoint students don't really hear much, I went through some of the literature on what masculinity is and how some of the terms that have been described as toxically masculine by the American Psychological Association. So things like stoicism, dominance, competitiveness, aggression have actually been valued throughout human history. So what we now call toxic has actually been seen as beneficial. And ironically enough, not only has it been beneficial, but women have selected men for it because
Hmm.
one of the things evolutionary biology has to contribute to this debate is that men are the product of women's choices. So the sexes differ as a result of sexual selection, so not natural selection. You and I, as men, are the product of millennia of women's choices.
Yeah. Good choices.
That's right.
Especially
Yeah.
for you
Well,
with that jawline.
what this offended people with though is that it means that what we call patriarchy is rooted in female biology.
Yeah.
It's not a social construct that men have sat down together and conspired with one another to produce to oppress women. Instead, women have selected um, physically powerful, psychologically dominant men who are competitive and aggressive and are going to be good at three main things. And the literature suggests that it's procreating, protecting, and providing. Yep. So women want to have babies,
How many
and they
kids
want
do you have,
men
Will?
who. I've got 6 kids. So women want to have babies. They want someone who's going to provide for them while that happens, because being pregnant for 9 months is hard. You're not going to be go out. If we go back to earlier times, let's go imagine Stone Age, because although we've got all this wonderful technology, our actual brains and bodies are fundamentally the same as our Stone Age ancestors. So it's a strange disconnect between what's around us and then what we are internally.
Yeah.
If you're pregnant, especially towards the end of the pregnancy, you're not going to be going out on long range hunting missions. You're not going to be straying far from home gathering food. Same as well when you've actually got a nursing baby. You don't want to be putting yourself in danger or the baby in danger. So women have selected men who are suited to the tasks that, to put it bluntly, they can't perform as well. And then we get what's called the traditional set of masculine virtues stemming from that. So we've got masculine biology, which is the result of what women have shaped. And then we think, well, okay, what kind of traits would a man need to have to make him exceed or excel in all these roles? And things like courage come up, things like honor, things like stoicism, psychological toughness. And again, it's odd that the things that have been especially important, whether it's in war or whether it's in hunting, for example, are actually the things that nowadays boys are told are worst about themselves, and they should be trying to reimagine. You hear this disturbing phrase, reimagine masculinity. Well, if only it were true that it were just something invented out of thin air and these people could easily reinvent it according to their own vision, then they'd have a great time. Everyone could be refashioned according to their vision of what a man should be. But the reality is that things aren't infinitely plastic. You can't twist it and morph it into whatever you want. There's a limit to what culture can do. Think of it as like a flower which has got its roots in the soil. So masculinity is a flower with its roots in the soil of biology, and culture can water it and tend it and encourage it to grow. And that's what we do with the traditional expectations about chivalry, for example, and how men are supposed to be particularly protective towards women. It's far worse for a man to beat up a weaker man than it is for him. Sorry, it's far worse for him to beat up a woman than it is for him to beat up a weaker man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all boys know that, men know that, and
Yeah.
you get even in prisons, for example, the honor codes.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I have, unfortunately, not myself, but I have very close-hand experience of those things. Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, at the end of the day, I imagine you can't really mess too much with biology, and as you say, we've had so long. Evolution has just sort of taken so long to evolve this sort of perfect machine, and now we're just being told, no, 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 that's not what you want to be like. And here we are.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess. I just look around the world and think, I I tell you what I really think. A lot of people are tend to conflate, I think fairly, the modern sort of woke movement, the cultural takeover, with the Marxist movements, and there are many sort of reasons for that. But I look around the world and see other countries still behaving very much in the sort of age-old way. So if you look at China, China are not reducing their empire; they're growing their empire, even physically, like by landmass. Excuse me. They're taking over countries. They're finding ways of moving into countries. They obviously have probably the most powerful hold in Africa at the moment. We know they're trying to build their route to Africa. Um, we know that we've seen what's been going on at the factories where the pay is sort of $2 a day, where they have the nets outside the factories, which could be looked at as similar to slavery. And then in Russia are obviously not shrinking their empire, they're growing their empire as well. And I look at the West and think that we're just the complete opposite. Like I just don't see any future. Do you?
Interesting question. No future along the current trajectory. I would say that if we carry on as we're going now, then what history shows is that a culture that acquiesces in its own decline like this will eventually, because of the weakness it is displaying, invite attack from
Mm,
more aggressive, more assertive nations. This seems to be just a fact of nature. So the different nations exist in relation to each other in terms of what the philosopher Hobbes described as the state of nature and being red in tooth and claw. So this is just like how the weakest animal is the one get picked off by the predators.
mm,
Same kind of thing. Weakness is going to invite attack, and a woke military is going to be a weak military. And China, Russia, they can sense this. And it's not a coincidence that just as we are pushing the emasculation of young boys, men, and trying to change the face of the military,
mm.
China is embarking on basically a masculinization program. So they want effeminate pop stars taken off social media, taken out of the highlight, the spotlight in culture. And
Mm.
boys are being taught traditional masculinity in schools as part of official lessons at the request of the
Right.
government. So they're going in the opposite direction from
Yeah.
what we are.
Is that because they've seen the effect that a little taste of the West has had on their young men, or is it just because they think that that's what you should do? Do you think?
I think it's partly about seeing the effect of it on the West and being concerned about where things might be heading if China follows.
Right.
And it's
Okay.
also about a return to traditional values, I think. Some of the elements of traditional Chinese society seem to be being reaffirmed, and the value of the family has been made a little bit clearer recently.
Mm. Yeah. I guess the one-child policy didn't work as well as they'd. Well, maybe it did work as well as they hoped. A lot of people always say it didn't, but I think what they wanted to do was stunt growth for a while, and now they're 12 years away from becoming twice as rich as America has ever been.
Mm.
But obviously now they're having to grow their families up again.
Yeah, it's definitely an area to watch. I think you're right to bring it up as an interesting one.
So going back to the sort of the event, I just wondered, how did other teachers and or parents support you or not support you?
When there was a debate about decolonizing the curriculum, and there was a big open letter about how Black Lives Matter was so important. It got about 500 signatures, roughly. And that just puts in perspective that the open letter asking for me to be reinstated uh, got nearly 3,000, I think it was.
Wow.
So it was a much bigger thing than that woke hot topic. Now,
Yeah.
that suggests that the strength of feeling among the student body, the parent body, and quite a few teachers signed it too, was pretty high. So, in
Yeah.
other words, this wasn't just some minor peripheral thing just to do with me. He just happens to want to talk about these ideas. No, this goes right to the heart of the school, which has got a room called debate in every single boarding house because it's such a big part of its culture. George Orwell went to Eton and he said that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. And now you've got one teacher saying, I don't want to hear that. And I don't want students to hear it either.
Yeah.
So people know that the soul of the school was at stake.
There's some sort of bitter irony that George Orwell attended Eton, and now Eton, could be the beginning of the end. But anyway, let's stay positive. So I just wondered, like, on a personal level, when you were at university, which, don't want to give away your age, but, it was sort of a decade and a half plus 1 year ago. I just wondered how you found it there. Like, was it, because I didn't go to university. I just wondered if you were seeing any signs of this back then, if it was, you could see it loosely, but not really, or if it was kind of loosely scattered over everything or what.
Yeah, I noticed it at university. I think it's really intensified over the last 3-4 years, around 2018 onwards. I think it's really accelerated. But when I was at university, I noticed it too. That is partly because I read English at university, and for reasons we can get into, English degrees and English departments have been the epicenter of woke.
They have,
So
yeah.
I noticed that a lot of the courses on offer were to do with queer theory, feminism, and exactly the kind of what are termed cultural Marxist framings of society and literature that are central to the woke politically correct narrative. Now, they weren't compulsory. You didn't have to do them. You could do things like Old Norse epic heroic literature. You could do things like Shakespeare. But even then, with the content matter being very different from reading novels about gay life in Paris and London, for example, you still got some of those critical theories being presented. So
Yeah.
it's quite hard as a student to avoid that particular worldview everywhere.
Yeah. I just feel like it's crept up on everyone, like the whole thing. It was always there in the background, but I don't ever really remember anybody being like this until maybe 4 years ago, when suddenly 80% of everybody was like this. And I just wondered if you have the same sort of thing. Like, did it come as a shock? Has it all come a bit rushed, even though you were in education, where obviously you'd have a bit of a head start?
No, to be honest, partly from being in education, watching colleagues, and listening to what the teacher training courses were like, I knew where it was all heading. And if you go back before to the inception of this around the 1930s, some people would put it earlier, going back to Marx and Engels. But around the 1930s, with the Frankfurt School, and then through the 1960s, as those ideas get transferred to America with philosophers like Herbert Marcuse,
Yeah.
you've got the intellectual roots of this being set down early on, and it's something that's been a long time in the making, and it's allowed to progress like this because people think that appeasement and sensible debate, the way they normally deal with intellectual topics, is the way forward. But it doesn't work because you're dealing with a movement, you're dealing with activists who regard debate, regard rational discussion as just a tool of the oppressor. These people don't really even believe in truth. They think that if you are arguing with them, you're just oppressing them using logic and reason as tools of the patriarchy. So the whole thing is rigged in their opinion, and that's why they don't respect it. So you're being fooled. You're playing their game if you think that conceding ground to them is going to make them go away. They will just use it to take more and more ground.
Hopefully I wasn't interrupting you. Do you think that now they've linked? I guess in the UK it's only been the last 3 or 4 years again, but maybe in America definitely it's been a bit longer. But now they've linked the woke to race. How do we move forward from here without being divided? I mean, I just don't know how we, like, when you have. I'll give you a quick example, and I know that this is hits closer to home to you than some other people. But like, for example, my son was at school. His school is like an average sort of country-ish school. And when the maybe not so much now, but for about a year, they the some of the black kids in his school, and they did not want this, I should say. These white kids would go out at lunchtime and get on their knees, and they would be like, "We need to apologize to Jaden. Get on your knees. You need to apologize." And he'd be like, "For what?" "Because your ancestors did bad things to his ancestors." And Viv said that these kids did not want this, but it was just something that these weird white kids were kind of leading against. But I don't know how we can set, because I feel like in the late 90s and the 2000s, everything was really good. I mean, mostly really good. No one gave a crap either way. And now it's kind of forced the issue into where everybody's like walking on eggshells, and they're like, "Oh, I don't want to offend you. I don't want to offend you." But we have to get on because nobody's going anywhere, nor should they. So what do we do? I just can't. This is probably the biggest issue I'm worried about, because I think in America it looks like they're just becoming two different tribes. You know, the people of color, if you want to say that. Although I think that the Latino people have been way more oppressive than the white people in the Americas, 10 times the slaves. And the whites. And obviously, you have a small spillover. So most of the people that aren't in the Democrat Party, I think it's about 20% of them are not white. And then in the Democrat Party, you obviously got your portion of white people. So it's never going to be complete one side and the other. But this is definitely an issue that's coming, isn't it? Like, is this avoidable?
I'm not sure if it's avoidable, because human beings are tribal. People will tend to associate with people like them and will value their own traditions. And ironically, there are few places where that is clearer than Africa. If you
Yeah,
go around to different parts of Africa and think about the tensions between them,
I
a lot
know.
of those tensions are tribal. They're all black. Like, the skin color isn't the main point. It's about
Mm.
group identity. And you're right that woke has been linked to race. But people need to understand that isn't necessarily because the woke activists are really interested in race or passionate
No,
about it. It's just because it is a sore point to poke society in and agitate. So if you can drum up enough aggression, enough irritation around that particular sore point, then you might produce enough civil unrest to get the revolution going. And this is really what critical theory is. A lot of people spend time trying to figure out what really is critical theory. What's the set of propositions that it lays out? The
mm.
clue's in the name. It just is to criticize. The whole social order is corrupt and needs to be subverted and brought down. And there's no real substantive vision of what they're going to replace it with. The closest I've seen it being articulated as is Marcuse, who just said it's all about pleasure. The new society is based around pleasure.
Mm.
So if people see the world in terms of conflict and simplified groups, whether it's men versus women or blacks versus whites, then you are falling into the exact trap that they are setting for you. And it
Mm.
would be much more sensible to study history and see things from a more sophisticated, higher perspective. Let's take slavery, for example. It's
Mm.
universal and it existed long before the transatlantic slave trade. It
Yeah.
also happened to a far greater extent within Africa. The Muslims enslaved more Africans than the Americans did. Three-quarters of the African slaves for the transatlantic slave trade were provided by the Africans themselves. So these
Oh
things are
wow.
complex. Yeah,
Mm.
these things are complex. When the British delegates went to try and stop the slave trade, the African powers said, no, sorry, look, we don't want to stop. It's too profitable. So it's complex, and you can't just give people this very straightforward, simplistic view of it and then
Mm.
expect to politically um, activate or agitate them with it.
Yeah.
People need to have an informed understanding, and this is why history has been one of the subjects that's so tightly controlled.
Yeah, dude, like almost every day now, I don't know, for the last 2 or 3 years, and maybe it was me being too busy or just too ignorant, but I literally every day now I think of what things in history are not as they seem, because you can see how easily I know it's slightly different now because we have such a powerful media, that's just it has its tentacles everywhere, and obviously a lot more people. Maybe that makes it less powerful. I don't know, but I see how quickly they can change the narrative on things, and yeah, it makes me look back and think. I wonder how many things didn't happen or happened slightly different, or you had a general that was a bit of a knob, but he wanted to have a really nice piece of history written about him, so he claimed to fight a bear before he fought 17 men. And we celebrate that today, like, yeah, that dude killed 17 men and a bear. But I don't know, man. I don't know. I just look at history in a much, much different light in the last few years than I did before.
Yeah, that's very wise to do that. And ultimately, people's education is their own responsibility, not the government's, and parents are the primary educators of children. So a lot of this has happened because parents have complacently offloaded the education of children onto the state, assuming that everything is going to be fine.
Mm,
But it's turned out that no, it's really not. And if you spend more time talking to your kids about exactly what they're being taught, how they're being taught it, you get more and more concerned. I know people who've told me, people with first-hand experience through their families of the Russian Revolution, that they are terrified of the way that topic is taught to kids in secondary schools. They said they can go through the textbooks and they can see
mm.
what's being left out, and it's just lies. And
Wow.
one of the clearest examples is the stress placed on the teaching of Nazi Germany and the idea that Hitler is a right wing monster when he was a socialist.
Yeah.
Hitler is left wing. He's to the right of Marx, but he's still left wing, hence the name
Yeah.
National Socialist. Yep, it's
Yeah.
obvious. But most kids will say, oh, yeah, Hitler's right wing just
Mm,
because he's to the right of Marx.
yeah.
Meanwhile, the history of communism is something that not many students know much about. That one's been kept fairly low key. And
Yeah.
that's a clue that people need to look into it more. If you haven't been directed to a topic, it's because it's one they don't want you to look at.
Mm. That's an interesting. Yeah, you should make that your slogan. So, of all the sort of, did you have the teachers' unions involved at some point, and how have they been with you?
No, I wasn't a member of a teachers union. I don't like any of them. I don't trust them.
Why
So
not?
in general, they seem to be largely left-wing organizations. So that I was suspicious about them, and the level of legal depth that my case went into anyway, it went beyond what a teachers union would have helped with.
Okay, okay, I'm with you. Um, obviously, when this happened, how did you receive threats, or because you were such a big name for a period, and I saw people from the left obviously calling you the usual hilarious names, which was ironic, and I wondered if maybe also you'd had anybody approach you to say you could be the new face of such and such, right wing thing or conservative thing, and no,
No, no,
oh, they
it's
missed the trick.
I've just been largely left to get on with my life, which is nice in a way, but also I can imagine would have been really terrifying for some people. And it's why more people don't speak up, even if they agree that what's going on around them is bad. They're just terrified to get off the teat of these institutions. They just want to stay there suckling on it, hoping that
Mm,
if they shut their eyes and stick their fingers in the ears, then everything's going to be okay in the end. But
yeah.
I highly doubt that's the case.
Where did you? I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, Will. but you're slightly different to the normal person. You know, you lift ridiculous amounts of weights. You have, a pretty steeled backbone. You have 6 children, which I am massively grateful for, because more people that think like you need to have 15 children. But I wondered, where has all this come from? Like, you have something about the military about you. Were you raised by someone in the military, or just raised by good people? Or talk to me.
No, I've got. If you go back into my family on both sides, you've got people who were military, but that's not unusual for that time. Most
Hmm.
people's families have got that. I just think it's that I was genuinely passionate about education and about ideas and the importance of free speech. And this is an unusual time. We have really come to a crunch point, and there are lines you can cross that you can't go back over. And
Mm.
if a point of no return is going to be there in education, I think teachers cancelling lectures, making it so that students can't hear ideas, is one. And
Mm.
not only that, they're not even allowed to listen to the lecture in their own homes, in their free time on YouTube either. So, what are they going to do next? Go around their houses and confiscate books from their bedrooms?
Probably. I mean, dude, like
It's
it's
happened before.
yeah, it's getting pretty bad. Like, I find myself, I'm a pretty average person. Like, I hold no extreme views or anything like that. And every single day, without fail, I find myself tripping over words to find words that I think will get past the censors on a variety of websites and obviously YouTube. And we never, we're very similar age. We never had this 15 years ago. Even 10 years ago, we didn't have this. So I don't know. Is it our generation that's now getting into power, and they're like, we're going to use everything that the sort of baby boomers and maybe the older Gen X people that were hippies, and because obviously I'd probably say it was the hippies that were the first mass marketed large group. I mean, I suppose you could call them mass marketed, that were really sort of against their own interests. You had America that was, it was a bad choice to go into Vietnam, and it was a wasteful war, and many people died. But the hippies that were spitting on these people when they came home were not out really for their own interest as a group. They have the most powerful country on earth, and still they're saying we don't have it good enough. We want it better. So I don't know. Like, is it our generation that's made a mistake because now we've come into power? That's into power.
Well, in the sense that luxury breeds complacency and ingratitude, I think you're right. You're onto something there. So if people have a very comfortable up and everything they want at the push of a button or the click of their fingers, then they lose gratitude for what they have. Even the poorest people today in America have got a standard of living that is greater than some of the richest people of the not too distant past.
Yeah.
So, gratitude would be my first step to healing some of the people who are full of rage at the society around them and think it needs to be torn down. And it's interesting that resentment and guilt are the things that are mainly encouraged. You mentioned kids kneeling in playgrounds, ashamed of what their ancestors have done to other people's ancestors. That's a good example of it. Why
Mm.
not be grateful instead for the fact that the British Empire is one of the most benevolent ones that's ever existed,
I
and
100% agree.
seeded the development of several advanced economies that would never have come to exist without it, and that it stopped the
Absolutely.
slave trade?
But I just think that there were so many things that don't get taught, that the British Empire, and obviously, like, I am going to be biased, but I just see, like I said before, I see other empires still empire building in 2022. And we handed our empire back, apologized, paid the tab, built an armada to patrol the coast where people were slaving from 190 years ago. Yeah, about 190 years ago. And somehow we're the bad people. But not our ancestors. You and I are the bad people, apparently. It's a difficult one, man. How do you talk about culture with your kids? Obviously, we have kids of a well, I only know the age of a couple of your older ones, but similar age to my kids. And I just wondered if you've talked to them yet about culture. I kind of had to with my son because his school started saying that. So his auntie works for a charity in Africa. She gave up a job, a really good job in the UK to do that because she wanted to do good. And like 3 months later, he went into school, and in his one of his lessons, they were like, "White people should never be involved with African charities because it's disgusting and racist and all the rest of it." So I just wondered how you talk to your kids, if at all, about culture or politics or anything like that.
Yeah, I think the first step is find out what is happening in their schools. And then if they say, teacher X said Y and Z today, and you think, oh, I can see where they're coming from with that, but there's another side to that, then that's a
Mm,
discussion to have around the dinner table or in the car on the way home from school, and then fill in the gaps. And it doesn't take much guesswork to find out what the fault lines are going to be. So go with the basics, whether it is differences between men and women and traditional culture roles, for
mm,
example, in the family. Just talk about how things have been for the vast majority of human history in the vast majority of countries and cultures, and then put in perspective what they're being told in school as the new vision, and just say, well, what are the strengths of that? But to what
mm,
extent do you think it's likely to work? Is it really the case that these things are infinitely flexible based on what we know all societies have coalesced around so far? So there's never been a large, successful, stable, non-monogamous society. So how likely is it that what some of the woke activists describe as a polymorphous society, where basically it's like a big commune where everyone can have sex with each other and children are raised not by the nuclear family but by the whole village? How
mm,
likely is that? Have you ever seen that working before? No. So maybe next time that's discussed, just start to ask some more questions about it.
mm. Okay, that's good advice. And the other thing is, I had somebody speak to me today who, we're friends, but we have, well, very, very different views. And I wondered if you could answer something that he said to me, and I just politely said, "We'll have to agree to disagree." He said,
Yeah.
when I told him I was speaking to you, he said, "What? Oh, get some inside gossip on the leaders of our country," which obviously I don't expect. And then he said, "Those places," I assume he means private schools, and I disagree with this 1,000%. I think it's an absurd opinion, but it's his opinion, and that's fine. That they should be razed to the ground for, well, how did he put it? For making so much inequality. What would you say to that, Will? That private schools should be burnt to the ground for creating so much inequality?
Equality exists whether private schools exist or not. It's natural. You've got people who are gifted sprinters, for example, or gifted mathematicians, and you're never going to equalize that. You can
Mm,
actually see this in the amount of funding that goes into getting different groups into different activities. There are some people that, no matter what the resources and funding they're given, can never excel at particular activities. There are other activities that come so naturally to people that they need no help whatsoever. There's never been a white 100-meter gold medalist over the last, I've forgotten the number of Olympic finals, but it's huge. I think every single finalist in the 100
mm,
meters had West African genetics for something like the last 100 years or so. About that, I have to look it up. Um,
mm.
that tells you that there's a natural inequality there physically.
Yeah,
People
yeah,
accept this. Like kids know it intuitively on sports day.
yeah.
This also happens intellectually as well. There are some people who are just really bright, and you can work as hard as you want, and you're never going to be their equal. Now,
Mm,
the question is, what do we do about this? On the left, you can't go too far in the pursuit of equality, even if that means using government power to ultimately kill people. That's what's happened in history.
Yeah.
But it's odd. If people want to buy a really expensive car or go on really expensive holidays, or if people want to find the best footballers for the Premier League, it doesn't seem to cause as much fuss as if someone wants to have a really elite educational institution and spend their money on that. It's strange.
That's funny.
Elitism in sport, inequality in sport doesn't seem to get under people's skin as much. But imagine the Premier League if we said, no, 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 equal opportunities, anyone's allowed to play. What would happen to the standard of the game?
Yeah, go down. Way down.
Yep, exactly. It's good because it's elitist. Elitism is okay in sport. Everyone recognizes that. And in education, there are some institutions which are there to cater to that demand for the elite product.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also think, like, this guy is a very close friend of mine. It's unfortunate that we had such a difference of opinion on this. But at the end of the day, like, if people have been willing to part with their hard-earned money in the hopes that even if it doesn't make their child brighter, it will make their child more educated, better spoken, and have maybe better manners and more sport. Because at normal schools, there is essentially zero sport nowadays. And, I know a lot of people that went to private schools who were either there on a bursary, they were there on a sports scholarship, or even like their dads didn't have amazing jobs. They just chose, instead of spending their money on suits, cars, and holidays, they spent their money on the schooling.
That's true. The and same with grammar schools. The drive to close the grammar schools has ironically harmed. So it's exactly the same thing. So the opportunities that used to be presented to bright students from poorer backgrounds by grammar schools are now being presented instead by private school bursaries. Now, the grammar school system was largely based on the private school system, even to the extent that some of the grammar schools had things like gowns and used
Yeah.
the same terminology as the top private schools because they knew that that model worked. And then when that was taken away from the bright, poor students, it was one of the worst things that happened for education in the UK.
Yeah. When was that?
I can't remember exactly when it happened, but I think in around 1967, 1970, the majority of the heads of the civil service departments were ex-grammar school pupils. So it must have been shortly after that.
I mean, like, my dad went to a grammar school, and I spoke to his brother the other day, and he was talking to me about how it was so lucky that my dad got the chance to go to a grammar school, because he said, as much as they both played a lot of rugby, that it was always obvious that my dad was a really bright kid compared to the rest of them. And he was like, and I was fine with that. There's nothing I can do about the fact that he's bright. He's a nice guy. So I was just glad that there was something there that could take his extra ability and actually utilize it, and allow him to utilize it. And I feel like we're falling into the trap nowadays of just saying, well, if you have a special power, and I'm sorry to make this about race, but it just kind of is. If you have a special ability and you're white, especially, you need to be chopped off at the knees. But if you're not white, then that's okay, because you deserve it. But I don't know.
Well,
Maybe I'm wrong.
in a healthy society, everyone's talents and potentials are going to be nourished and fulfilled, and then make the most of them so that it benefits everyone. Even if all it is some guy who ends up making a fortune as an investment banker, then fine, he's going to pay lots of tax. See it that way.
I don't know, man. I just think there's so much, like you said earlier on, there's just so much hate in people at the moment. There's so much hate and sort of just ingratitude, if that's a word. Like, you would think
Yeah,
people born, you'd think people born in Britain would be amazingly grateful. James Lindsay. You know about James Lindsay?
Yep.
You need to. Have you had a chat with him yet?
No, no, I've watched a couple of things he's put out on social media. Seems
Hmm.
interesting, but I haven't spoken to him.
Okay. Yeah. No, I tweeted him the other day, and somebody that deals with stuff for him, because I think you two would have an amazing talk together. Because obviously you're more, although you're obviously sort of anti woke, or that you can see that woke is a problem for the West. You're obviously more focused in on, the problem with, well, with boys, with masculinity and education. And I think that's something that he is fairly into as well. Like he talks a lot about Macusa and the education of young boys, but the education of everyone really. Um, if you could go back, I know you've been asked this before, but if you could go back to that moment at Eton, would you do things any differently, or slightly differently, or just the same?
No, just the same because look, in theory, I should have been able to give that talk based on the fact that curriculum content is exempt and any ideas are supposed to be fair game for discussion.
Hmm.
Um, I also asked about having a YouTube channel, discussed that with the headmaster, and said, "Do you want me to put a disclaimer on it?" And he said, "Yeah, put a disclaimer on." I said, "What if someone gets offended?" He said that this wasn't going to be a problem, especially with the disclaimer. Then it turned out that the disclaimer was the problem because it had the word Eton in it, and someone might know that I work there because it said Eton, but they told me to put it on there. So
Hmm.
it was just absurd. And if the only thing I could have done differently was stay quiet and watch the place getting torn apart around me as some of its main traditions and principles are questioned and then in the end just dismissed and ignored. No, that's not a career that any self respecting person should want. And it's not what I went into education for either.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I feel you. What would you say to? I'm interested in this. What would you say to any parent? Yeah, let's say parent. Let's say they're in their 30s, early 40s, or 40s. They've lived a life where, they lived a fairly normal English life. Then they went to university, came out of university into a career. They've really read nothing other than The Guardian. They watch the BBC, and they think that any of these talking points that you or I read up about a lot and that we're talking about now are just fantastical far right talking points. What would you say to those people as
Well,
a teacher, as somebody that's been there?
the concept of far right is an interesting one because no one's been able to give a good definition of it. All it really means is someone who disagrees strongly with the left. People have tried to pin it down to ideas about race, for example, but really you can't find a unifying factor on the right. It's just a label that's applied to people who are the opponents of the left. Now, what does this mean for people who think this is all unimportant and likely to blow over and they should just carry on reading The Guardian? Well, what's called the Overton Window, which is the range of political concepts that are deemed acceptable to discuss, moves, it shifts. And what we're seeing now is that people who recently wouldn't really have been termed right wing at all are actually far right. They're even extremists. You can get cancelled for just saying that you think that trans women aren't women. And if you start to probe these topics, you'll see that the the moderate kind of just left of center position you're describing there, they will become far right too soon enough. And they need to think about the logical implications of the premises they accept regarding equality. Because the view on the left is that actually it can never go far enough. Once you accept some of these starting points and you're heading in that direction, then everything else logically follows. And that is why the window is shifting further and further left. So the feminists, for example, are now surprised that the trans movement is threatening some of the things they have fought for.
Yeah.
You could have predicted that based on what the initial premises they accepted imply. If you don't think a woman is defined by her ability to have children, so womanhood is the potential for motherhood, and you say, no, actually, it's about your career or your clothes or your makeup,
Mm.
well, you get some trans women coming along saying, we've got all those things. We wear dresses, we have makeup, and we're go getters in the same careers that women used to dominate. Now we're women too. And if you disagree with us, you're far right. There are some Guardian readers who are far right by that description. So it can
Mm.
happen to them too.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. It's so funny, like when you talk about it and you sort of lay it out cut and dry. You know, the sort of child in me can't help but giggle because it's so absurd. I just find it so absurd. You know, like when the Olympic Committee said that that you're only going to have to have identified as a woman for 6 weeks now to partake in an athletics game, and I think, what? So as I could be, I'm 6'3", I could go out, put a dress on, and be like, "Hey, I'm here to partake in a boxing match. Who's coming?" Or like a
Yep.
high jump, or the hurdles, or whatever. That just seems
Yep.
utterly insane to me.
It's crazy, yeah. Maybe I should have identified as a woman while giving a lecture, or maybe I should reapply for my job as a woman.
Maybe you should. Are you going to do that?
No, no, I'm quite happy as I am. Um,
Good
yeah,
stuff.
you mentioned that it's ridiculous, and apart from the principle of use it or lose it, and people not appeasing, say the thing that you know you're not supposed to say.
Hmm.
The best thing to do is ridicule. So this movement can't really tolerate humor whatsoever, and that ability to ridicule is so important. It's why they've been trying to tighten controls on memes and comedians. So the more people can poke fun at it, the more it will be exposed.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I agree absolutely. And they actually do that at school because at Riv School, my son's school, he told me, and I don't know how true this is, but I've heard it from a couple of the young lads on his football team as well, that well over half of the young girls in his year identify as bi, lesbian, pansexual, and they sort of go around in groups and they call themselves the Rainbow Kids. And this was terrifying me until he told me that, you know, they kind of, there are a lot of, there's not bullying because there's enough of them that they're not going to get bullied. But they sort of change their names and they change their clothes and they change their hair and they change everything. And so obviously there are, you know, the nicknames like the Alphabet Kids and stuff like that. And not that anybody wants kids to be bullied, but yeah, I think the movement as a whole does more damage to children that they don't take responsibility for. You know, they want kids to be this way, and they encourage children to be as they are being at my son's school, but they won't be there to clean up the mess.
Yeah, that's right, ultimately. And I think that strong families and parents taking a active interest in what children are being taught and remembering that they are the ones who are mainly responsible for their children's education is the way out of this. You can see the homeschooling movement growing in the US and in the UK as well, especially after COVID has meant that more parents have seen what's happening in lessons online. So I think there's some strong signs going ahead that people will come through, but it's not going to happen by people just shrugging and thinking it's going to blow over, because it definitely won't.
No, absolutely not. I'm glad you brought up homeschooling. So this is my view. I'll just be really quick because obviously we're here for you. Um, the only thing I worry about with homeschooling, my neighbors homeschool their kids, is that aren't we doing the woke people's jobs for them by plucking out the individualist kids, you know, the kids that do know, or let's not say the truth, but we'll just say they know an alternative history than what those kids are being taught. They have alternative political views than what those kids are being taught. And because they're from people like us, they're just more individualistic kids rather than herd children. So aren't we doing the left's, or not the left, I shouldn't say it like that, but whatever, like the woke's job by plucking all of our children out of the schools, and so we can just let them get on and run the future of our country? Isn't there a danger of that?
I'm not sure that leaving these institutions to become echo chambers and letting them travel further and further down the road to Rainbow Land is a bad thing, because all it will do is just accelerate this descent into absurdity. And you get to the point where children, being what they are, naturally wanting to push boundaries and challenge things, will start to question it anyway. And what's been happening so far, which is parents thinking, oh, I'll leave children in the schools and it will work out fine. I'm sure they'll come across a variety of different viewpoints. That hasn't worked out very well. And I would suggest that it's the strongest evidence that more needs to be happening within families, and new institutions need to be set up.
Okay. Do you think religion, the decline of religion, as we've seen religion in the UK go from 90 odd percent in the 1950s to, I think it's like 16% now of white people in the UK. And I only say white people because if you add Muslims, it goes up to sort of 22%. But the majority of the UK is very much lacking in religion, and the churches are not helping themselves, because when people are going to the church to try and find some sort of traditionalism, they're being met at the front door by a transgender vicar.
Yeah, and there are some high-profile people in the Anglican Church who have moved to the Roman Catholic Church because of that. Regarding most people now identifying as non-religious, that's an interesting one, because more often than not, they haven't really thought it through to a conclusion. And one of the services that the woke movement is providing is showing people what those conclusions really look like. And there's an increasing number of people who, although they're not describing themselves as Orthodox churchgoers, are still saying, hold on a minute, what about some of these traditional values that are now being threatened? And they're seeing what we are on the brink of losing. So that old saying that you don't know what it's got till it's gone, I think is going to start people wondering what that was rooted in and what a worldview that has a place for that looks like. And then you've got the first step on a journey back to what ultimately European civilization and Western civilization was based on, which is the fusion of Christianity with ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So that's where the roots of our culture really are, and people need to reconnect to them.
Yeah. Yeah, because I kind of had a bit of hope, because obviously America has always been such a religious country, but even they're starting to go downhill now. We're seeing, I think they're at 25% atheist, which is pretty big for America. But
Yeah, it is. I mean, what you're likely to see is a culture that has a kind of spiritual vacuum growing at its center. Will try to fill that with all kinds of surrogate religions and substitutes, and where totalitarianism ultimately comes from, because it's human nature to need to worship something, and the history of the 20th century shows that that ends up being the state. And it wouldn't surprise me if we get some kind of similar conclusion to the woke movement, because the more people's individual rights are stressed, the more you need some power to enforce them. So ironically, the state becomes more and more powerful in response to the demand of the woke movement, which is ultimately a form of cultural Marxism anyway. And we've seen how that has terminated in history before. The other possibility is you'll just get a spiritually strong society, which has got this unified worldview that people adhere to and are confident again, like Islam, which will take over. And looking
I
at
agree.
birth
Yeah.
rates alone, that is what is going to happen. The
Mm,
developed feminist societies will just be outbred by Islamic societies. And then
mm.
they'll find out what the kind of patriarchy they don't like really looks like.
I was thinking just that today, actually. I was thinking, they're living it up now, but when people get in that really do have a different opinion of women's rights, they're going to really regret, going the route they've gone. But then we're all a product of society, aren't we? So I think a lot of these girls, they watch Sex in the City and they thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to move to the city and sleep with 100 men? And then when I'm 70, I can move out and start a life with a husband that's 20 and a millionaire. Obviously, life doesn't work
Yeah,
like that, unfortunately.
there's an element of that. Luckily, we're not entirely a product of society, and people do get frustrated by the hollowness and fragility of these different narratives they've been presented with through pop culture, and
Mm,
women in particular who feel cheated of their childbearing years by being encouraged to go and act like men and prioritize careers
mm.
know that there's an element of trickery there. Even Simone de Beauvoir, the founder of modern feminism, felt that towards the end of her life.
Well, listen, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate this. I've been chasing you for a while, and I actually probably the day before you replied and said, "Yeah, no problem." I just thought, man, maybe he's just too busy. So thank you, Will.
It's been a pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish